Welcome to the first episode of The Link. Today we're going to be diving into trying to figure out how all of this equipment works with our audio and our video. So if you would, just pay attention to what we got to say because it's going to be marvelous things, I'm certain.
Obviously. Yeah.
So for today, we got two people joining us. First up, we got Chris LyBrand, who is over on this side. Chris, tell us about yourself.
Cool. My name's Chris from Charleston down the road. Just a junior here at UAFS, mechanical engineering student.
Rock on. And this is Hayden Woodhull. Hayden, what's up?
Hello, my name is Hayden. First of all, I like to party. And
All right, Hot Rod.
I am a sophomore here at UAFS, and I'm an IT major. So.
Rock on. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Lee Woodmansee. I'm the campus minister here at the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at UA Fort Smith. And this is a new venture that we're getting off into. And this is going to be the format that we're going to take for today. We're going to just introduce a topic. Then we're going to just dive into some questions these guys are going to answer just off the top of their head and kind of dive into some real conversation about some topics here. This is the first one. So here's where I want to set us up, where we're going. Today, what we want to talk about is basically podcasting. Now, that being said, I understand the irony of the concept of what we're going to be talking about is podcasting on something that looks like a podcast.
Correct.
But really what we want to get into is like how Christians are to digest this media, how we are to consume this in a healthy way, how it's beneficial, how can it not be beneficial, those types of things. So we're going to dive into that. But first, let me give us a couple of statistics. So I looked a lot of these up in the last couple of days. And a lot of it comes from Barna Group, Pew Research, a couple other media research firms, and that kind of jazz. Here's some statistics for us. The majority of podcast listeners are between the age of 18 and 24. Duh, right? Well, here's the problem is like the next largest group is from 25 to 54.
Jeez.
And that whole group makes up about 30% of the audience. 18 to 24 makes up 30% itself, right? So this is college students. This is high school students. These are folks right out of college. This is our age group for the most part. I say our, even though clearly I'm not in that age group. But talking about college students, like this is the age group that we're dealing with. So about 30% of all podcast listeners are between 18 and 24. The average podcast listener subscribes to how many podcasts do you think?
4.
4?
I think I'm subscribed to 4.
4?
That sounds about right.
The average podcast listener subscribes to 6, right?
Okay.
So they subscribe
Not
to
too far
6, and then on average, weekly, they listen to 5. Now, those 5, it doesn't necessarily mean that they listen to the exact same 5 every time, but 5 out of the 6, they can be different lengths, longer, shorter, whatever. There's not a whole lot of good detailed information because podcasts run the gamut. But so subscribe to 6, listen to about 5 per week. And here's the one that's really big, especially for podcasts that are a little bit longer, is upwards of 85% of listeners hear either the entirety of the podcast or at least the majority, meaning 70% or more. Right. So
Okay.
if that's true, that means that if somebody's listening to, on average, 5 one-hour podcasts a week, that's 5 hours just right there, right? And so in our situation in Fort Smith, like clearly a lot of people drive. So if they're commuting back and forth, if you're like Chris, commuting, that might be something that's really appealing in that you can listen to your entire week's commute. But at the same time, if you were listening to anything beyond that, well, man, now we've entered into the realm of like, we're not just ingesting 5 hours, we're ingesting 7, 8, right. So that just kind of helps frame the conversation here. But this is the first question I want to ask you guys. And this is just, your personal statements. It doesn't have to be like some super Christian answer or anything like that. But what are some podcasts that you regularly listen to? Chris, we'll start with you.
I know the one that I listen to the most is the Rooster Teeth podcast.
Okay. And what do they talk about on the Rooster Teeth, on the RT podcast? Anything?
I know, like, about a month and a half ago, they got a guy on and they were talking about forming a consciousness from an AI, but yet they play video games.
That's interesting.
So they talk about anything. They'll go off rants, and it could be anything.
Gotcha. All right, what else?
It's another podcast from the Rooster Teeth Company called Off Topic.
Wow. Fanboy.
You know it. That's done by Achievement Hunter, and they just do the same thing. They just sit around a table like this and just talk for about 2 hours.
Oh, wow, 2 hours.
Oh,
they range from about an hour will be their shortest to about 2.5 to be their longest.
Well, so how much of that do you say that whenever you do listen, that you listen to the majority, if not all of it? What percentage-wise do you listen to on average?
Oh, the Rooster Teeth podcast, 100%. I'll watch it from beginning to end. The Off Topic, I'll listen to about 70%, maybe.
Gotcha.
Maybe a little bit less.
Just because of its length?
Just because of the sheer length of theirs.
Gotcha. Any others?
That's about it. I'll occasionally listen to Hayden's over there, Hayden and Andrew's
The old
podcast.
Rockin' Wood podcast.
You know
Free
it.
plug.
Rocking Wood. It's classic.
It's an instant classic. All right, so Hayden, what about you? What are some other podcasts that you listen to?
I'm subscribed to about 4, but I think I usually listen to like 2 a week, maybe. The first one is the H3 podcast.
Yeah.
I listen to that one all the way through, but on those they're usually delayed because I don't listen to them unless I'm driving. Like I don't just like sit down and listen to podcasts. I usually do them while I'm driving. I'll usually listen to the full thing. But they've had podcasts that are up in like the 5-6 hour range. So like I'm not gonna listen to all that.
Right.
I usually listen to all those, and then the second one is called the PC Perspective podcast. Basically, it's 5 dudes who Skype call in and they record it all, and they just talk about different things that are going on, like the PC building world this week. You know what's coming up, that kind of stuff. I usually listen to that one while I work. So I'm slapping meat sandwiches together. Working on orders in the kitchen.
You want to frame that statement like
I work at a barbecue restaurant.
Okay.
So yeah, usually I'll listen to it while I'm doing that because it's such a mindless task.
Yeah.
So when they're talking about like clock speeds of different computers and stuff, I just have that running through my mind. So it's not such like a autopilot make orders thing. It just kind of keeps my mind rolling, And I'll usually listen to the full thing. But other than that.
Gotcha. Do you have any others that kind of branch off of those two, just like the random H3 stuff or the PC building? Or is that where your interests are normally aligned in that regard?
That's usually it. I've listened to the Joe Rogan a couple times. I'm like I said, I'm subscribed to a couple more. I just don't really listen to them. What I'll do is I'll look at the feed, and if they're interviewing someone I see interesting or they're talking about an interesting topic, that's usually when I'll tune into theirs. But like the Joe Rogan, I'm not a weekly listener for him or anything.
Yeah, especially because JRE experience, the Joe Rogan experience, if you don't know, JRE typically it can go 2 to 4 hours.
Oh yeah.
I mean it can be anywhere in there, and there's no way to predict the agenda. In fact, I don't think they really even have an agenda. They have a guest, or Joe Rogan has a guest, and they just kind of go from there.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm with you. And a lot of times, so you can just catch the replays on YouTube.
Yeah.
For a lot
the
of it.
highlights.
Yeah, just hit the highlights. Right. So for me, podcasts I listen to, about the only sport that I actually follow is mixed martial arts. So there are 2 MMA podcasts that I really listen to. One is called The Co-Main Event. This guy's named Chad Dundas and Ben Folks. And these cats are up in Missoula, Montana, out in the middle of nowhere. And these dudes are hilarious. It's good stuff. They have a couple of solemn vows that they won't go over an hour and 15 minutes. They don't ever have guests. It's just them 2 talking.
That's fun.
And so like it's a pretty good format.
It's
and then
structured.
Yeah, exactly. So they have structure. They do 3 rounds. They take questions, like listener mail, and then they have 3 distinct rounds. And then when that's done, they're done. A guy named Luke Thomas is another dude who does a lot of MMA reporting, and he does a live chat, and that typically goes about an hour and a half, but it's similar in the same way that I use it, like whenever I'm cleaning at home, putting up dishes and stuff from the girls, cleaning up the house, that kind of jazz. Like it's kind of
those
just
mindless tasks.
Exactly. It's one of those things that's just in the background, and I don't have to devote a whole lot of attention. And if they're talking about something I don't care about, just tune it out and you keep rolling.
Right.
So those are the 2 that I hit every week, pretty much every single week. I'm going to catch them at some point because I've got to clean. We've got to do dishes, got to do laundry, that kind of jazz. So you might as well just do that then. The other podcast that I really listen to is occasionally I will hit the Joe Rogan Experience, but we're going to talk about why is one of the podcasts I listen to here in a bit. But there's other ones that I hit almost daily, especially during the semester, is The Briefing with Al Mohler. And that's because he does, his whole introduction is that it's a look at the current events and news of the day from a Christian worldview. So whatever it is they're talking about is like the news items of the day, but he looks at it from a very biblical Christian perspective about how to actually deal with whatever you see in the news. Two other ones that I do dabble in is the Gospel Coalition podcast. They have a handful of different people that kind of run those. The Gospel Coalition, and then another one is called Doctrine and Devotion. These are two very reformed dudes who like to smoke cigars, and they talk about theology and everything else. So it's just kind of off the beaten path. So, I mean, I've got a couple of mixed martial arts ones. I've got a couple of like news, a couple of NPR podcasts that I'll listen to occasionally, The Briefing, those types of things. But for me, whenever it comes to podcasts and things of that nature, I try to expose myself to more than just one type. So the question I kind of want you guys to talk about now is like, what's your method of trying to figure out what you're going to consume when it comes to podcasts? Because when it's Rooster Teeth or it's H3, you're not going to be able to predict what the topic is going to be, much less the guests that they have on there. So how do you decide this is what I'm going to listen to, this is what I'm not? Kind of what's your metric that you use?
Based on like episodes or like what podcast we're going to listen to?
Yeah, both.
Both? Okay. I'll start with an episode, like episode to episode standpoint. When it comes to the H3 podcast, like usually at the beginning of the month they'll release their lineup, like who they're gonna interview. Not necessarily what they're going to talk about, but when they say who they're going to interview, you kind of get in your mind, okay, this is what they're going to talk about. For instance, they had like a really popular game developer on their podcast last week, and they just talked about the game like pretty much the whole time. A week before that, they had a really popular YouTuber, and so they talked about YouTube careers.
Right.
So when it comes to that, when I see like the lineup, I'm like, okay, I know this guy, I've followed him for a while. I'll go ahead and listen to this one. If it's someone I don't know, usually I'll listen to like the first 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. And if it's interesting, sure, I'll keep listening. No big deal. But if not, I'm like, whatever.
And that's where stuff like Joe Rogan Experience doesn't do you any good, because the first 20 minutes might be awesome.
Right.
And then the rest of it, who knows?
It's just
or vice
random.
versa.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
When it comes to the other one, the PC perspective, it's more like their episode comes out, which they're at like episode 500 or something like that.
That's a few.
These guys have been doing it for a while, and it's weekly. So basically this says, join with us. We're going to talk about, this that came out this week, this what's coming out next week. And they kind of give you little timestamps at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Like,
that's good.
Around this time, we're going to be talking about this. So if I want to know just about this new thing that's coming out, I'll skip ahead. And then maybe if I like it enough, I'll, skip back to the beginning and listen to the whole thing. But that's how I do it episode to episode. But I think if it's more of a podcast, like looking for one to subscribe to, I really start out just by going to the search bar and like searching like PC parts, or I'll go to the categories like comedy or hobbies and stuff like that, just things that interest me. But then after that, I might go to like Reddit and look through what people recommend, honestly, because I mean, there's so many podcasts that do the same thing. I want to find one that's set apart that I can really get into. You know what I mean?
Cool.
That's my way.
Chris, about you?
Cool. I know for at least the Rooster Teeth podcast, they have no set definition other than, hey, we're going live on Monday nights. You can either watch it live or watch it later when it comes out on YouTube, and I watch it later when it comes out. And I'll usually click on it, and they always have 4 people usually set up in like an area, and based off who those 4 people are, I will either listen to it or not, because they have 4 main people that are almost always on, and I will always watch those 4 main people. Right. But when they start switching them out, there are some people I like to listen to and some people I don't. And like, so when people that I don't like to listen to are on the podcast, I'll just go, nope.
I've noticed with those, like you said, there's people you like listening to and there's people that aren't. But some of the main people, like, they lead the conversation. So when they're gone, it's like, there's no like conversation lead. It's just kind of like, here's the conversation. And they just kind of go off, and yeah, I understand what you mean.
Like some of the main people, they always have their MacBooks with them, and because they do it live, they're like, hey, tweet us at our hashtag, and so they'll be looking at that, and that will move stuff along as well. But when those people aren't there, it's just kind of bland. They were just,
there's no moving steps.
They're there because they were asked to, and nobody else could be there.
Right.
So just based off the people who are in the podcast. Same with the off-topic one. It's usually the same guys, and I'll always watch them. But with them, there is no uniformity to their show. One week, all they did was build a puzzle on the table.
Oh gosh!
They talked. They just talked, and they had a sky cam looking down on them building the puzzle, and all they did was talk. It was actually a pretty interesting episode.
Oh gosh!
But just with them, it's random. So it's like you either will watch it, most of it, or you won't watch it, and it's just up in the air. And if I'm trying to find any new podcasts, I'm not in depth as Hayden over there. I'll just go on YouTube and type podcast, see what comes up, listen to like the first 10 minutes, and be like, if I like it, I like it. I'll continue listening. If I don't, I'll just go find another one.
Right, and I think it's interesting. We keep talking about podcasts, and whenever I was in college, podcasting was when it really started taking off. This is mid 2000s. Podcasting then was literally iTunes podcasts, right? And it was all nothing but audio. But what y'all have referenced each time has been audio primarily is the means in which this is communicated, but every bit of it is through the vehicle of YouTube, right?
Right.
So that I think changes the equation about how we actually consume this kind of media. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to yours?
I mean, that kind of adds into the Rooster Teeth one. They have like a whole production stage for theirs. And since it's live and they also have a crew, they have multiple cameras. Right. And based off the conversation,
it's more like a show.
Yeah. If two people start arguing, they'll have two cameras get put up with them side by side and them arguing at each other. But at the same time, it's, not, scheduled out. We're going to talk about this. It's just wherever the flow goes, and the cameras kind of
it's interesting
push it along.
Because like I don't watch podcasts on YouTube. I don't do any of that. I just download it through the iTunes podcast app. I just listen to it. Like they're both live shows that they have like cameras and set lists and all that, but I just listen to the audio, and it sounds very like very old fashioned if you think about it like a podcast. You think about it like a radio. You know what I mean? And to think like, oh, this is interesting is weird because you have, video, you have so many different things you could do. You could listen to music, you could watch videos, but like,
I'm gonna listen to two dudes talking to each other.
Yeah, for real. It's interesting how interesting it is.
Yeah, just this conversation aspect. And I think that's kind of the key. So part of the question that I kind of want to dive into is like the method of deciding what you're going to listen to. Like I don't listen to the Joe Rogan experiment because I find everything that he says to be correct or wholesome. Definitely not, right? Like I listen to stuff that's on NPR and I listen to stuff that's JRE because it is different than what I listen to already. Right, because there's this idea of just the echo chamber. If you have this one set of thoughts and opinions, and if you just keep listening to that over and over and over again, like you never hear any new input, new information. And so like there are times when I intentionally go out of my way to find these other, sources of opinion and thought that are going to drive possibly what I would think, not so that I would agree with them, but rather so that I would even just be exposed to that. Does that ever come into play for you guys, or do you look at podcasts as purely something that is entertainment based, and that if it's not entertaining, then you're done with it?
Well, I mean, for me, like I listen to podcasts for entertainment, but like I think you've heard of this guy, Steven Crowder. Mm-hmm. I think he does a podcast or something along the lines of that, and I'll occasionally listen to him just because, like, I listen to the Rooster Teeth ones because it's entertainment, they're funny, they have the most bizarre conversations, but Steven Crowder's over here, talking about, like, the political stuff that's happening in the world, and, he tries to see both sides, but it's quite obvious.
Right.
He leans where he's at when it comes to political stuff, so, I mean, I try to reach out when it comes to that kind of stuff occasionally.
Right.
I mainly try to stay on the entertainment side because those sometimes political podcasts can get heated.
Yeah,
Right.
with people.
absolutely. What about you, Hayden?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, the reason I started listening to podcasts is because I got bored to listening to music in the car.
Yeah. I get
Like,
that.
I'd have my playlist, and I'd keep like, I'm like, okay, I'll add a song, I'll add some more, I'll take these out, it'll make it better. But listening to music is boring. It
You know what's coming.
just is.
You know what's coming.
You've heard the songs thousands
Right.
of times.
So
And
I
it
think,
has its place. There's a role for it. but
right.
It fits into it.
But for me, driving and listening to music isn't. I just don't like it.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I got into podcasts. So that, for me, it's more of like entertainment. Keep me entertained while I drive. Doesn't necessarily mean like tell jokes, make me laugh. Like keep me interested while I'm driving. Keep my mind thinking.
engaged one way or another.
Right.
Yeah.
To me, I'm not a huge fan of listening to politics or hearing people's opinions on politics. I see myself as a very like silent majority. I kind of keep my political thoughts to myself, and I really don't. I'm not a fan of everyone just like shooting out their political opinions.
I like how you're looking at me.
I'm
because
looking
I was
right at
talking.
you.
Is that you?
I don't know.
No, I'm just looking around. But for me, no, it's more entertainment or interesting topics.
Gotcha. Well, then, so that leads into the next question that I want us to talk about is like when we talk about podcasts being this type of media, right? Whether it's actually through YouTube on video or you're just downloading the audio or you're listening to it live or after the fact, it doesn't necessarily matter. But at what point do you make the conscious decision that podcasts, in whatever manner it may be, are going to replace another form of media that you're going to consume? So for you, that decision was made. I don't want to listen to music in the car, so I'm going to listen to something else, and that just turns out to be these 2, 3, 4, however many people talking to each other. But at what point does a podcast, like that you make the conscious decision that I'm going to do this instead of something else? Because I feel like there's something to that process of how we come to that point. You want to talk through that at all?
Well, mine's kind of on the line with Hayden's about the whole music gets boring sometimes. Like when I'm at work, I don't do a lot. So it's a very boring job. So I'll pull up, the Rooster Teeth podcast, ones I haven't listened to, and just have it playing in the background instead of music because I can go to sleep to music real easily. Since it's a boring job, it's even easier. But having that conversation in the background of them just talking about random stuff.
Yeah.
So more of it's just keep me going, keep me thinking. Same with Hayden.
Right.
Yeah. It's weird to say it, but I think I don't want to say there's not enough music to listen to because obviously there is.
I think there is, yeah.
But when like in my situation, I listen to these certain artists and they come out with an album and I listen to it until I'm extremely tired of it. And then after that, I just won't listen to music until they come out with another album. Like I just
They're
won't.
just dead to you until the end.
Yeah. It's a very, which I mean, I don't know. Like I was in choir, I was in band. Like I appreciate music.
Right. The interests are aligned clearly, right?
But to me, like, what the artist is kind of going to sound like on the album. You kind of know the song's playing. You get 3 minutes of whatever. And then after that, you're like, okay, I could listen to the same thing. But with the podcast, it's like you have this 1.5, 2 hour long tangent.
Unknown. Yeah.
So twice a week. Why not?
Yeah, so it really comes down to, this is kind of the heart of the question, is like, what is our value system for saying I am going to listen to or watch this podcast as opposed to interact with another media through video games or something else along those lines, through watching a movie that's something that's kind of passive, through reading a physical book? Like, how do you make that determination? Is it simply I don't find those other things as interactive or as appealing or entertaining, and that is the reason why I'm kind of defaulting to a podcast? Or is it I am making a conscious decision that I would just rather not do that instead of doing podcasting?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
for me, I would rather not listen to music. I'd rather listen to a podcast.
Same with the whole listening to podcasts, just because they can go anywhere. With music or reading a book, you kind of know the train of thought it's going to go along. With podcasts, there is no train of thought.
Right. And so this is where I'm going. So this is ultimately where I want to kind of tie this back together with some of our statistics, is that between 18 and 24-year-olds, 30% of the audience is that age range, and those are people who are consciously either making the decision to say, I am not going to physically read a book. Instead, I'm going to watch this thing. Are there any natural dangers for college students who are into podcasting? Like, are there any necessary drawbacks that when we talk about how we consume podcasts as a medium?
I guess it could be. You could say, like in your situation, I'm bored. I don't want to, like, I'm bored at work. I don't want to listen to music. I'll listen to a podcast. That could be a problem when you're like, I'm bored studying. Let me listen to a podcast while I study.
So
and
that
at that
just
time,
becomes the
you're
default
like,
thing you do, regardless of where you're at.
Yeah, you have your studying in one ear, and then you have the podcasts in the other, and it just mixes, and it's just not good. That could be a danger, I would think. What do you think, Chris?
Well, let's see. I think it kind of goes along the line of what you said earlier about the whole political stuff. Like, as college students, and you've been through this, is when you hit college, you're open to a whole new world of ideas.
Oh yeah.
And you'll start exploring, I guess, those new ideas. And to some people, that can get really, like, heated stuff and just tear people apart, because I grew up this way, but everybody around me.
Yeah, but all these podcasts
podcasts are saying this thing, and they become really conflicted with their self.
Mm-hmm. So you think just the idea of, like, overexposure to things that we don't have a good metric of being able to vet as this is wholesome or edifying in any way, versus, I'm being exposed and it's okay, and then going down a slippery slope. Those two things might get conflated one way or another, or just unknown.
Yeah,
that's kind of what you're getting at.
That's like a whole can of worms. Though. Like, that's a yeah. I agree with that.
All right, so we've narrowed down to two main issues then. One is that if we are just using this as a default, if we use podcasting, if we've just kind of singled this out to be the media of 18 to 24-year-olds, right?
Yeah.
Even though that's not necessarily 100% accurate, because for every student that listens to podcasts, I guarantee you I could find 5 that binge watch an entire season of Netflix and waste way more time
than
doing the exact same function, right? But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, is those two dangers are: one, it just becomes the default to the point to where we simply just don't do anything else. Right. Or we have no good means for saying this is something I should be doing. This is something I should be exposed to, right? I wouldn't necessarily recommend people go and listen to Joe Rogan, right?
Yeah.
I don't. You're not going to hear me make recommendations, even though I said I listened to it and, like, hey, I'm kind of bearing my soul. Don't burn me for it. But at the same time, like, there's wisdom that goes along with that. Let me tell you, like, from my experience, whenever I was in college, podcasting really at that point was far more about, for me, was sermons, right? Was these pastors who were preaching sermons every week. Their churches were recording them, and they just uploaded them as podcasts. Well, what ended up happening is that me and a couple other guys that I knew, like, we were listening to 3 or 4 different pastors from all over the nation, and it was good soul, life-giving type stuff, right? But here's the danger of that. There's a couple of things. One is that whenever you have someone who is not your God-given spiritual authority speaking truth into your life, like, that can actually be dangerous for 2 reasons. Is one is, like, you're kind of circumventing the authority of the church that you're a member of, right? There's this pastor who's in front of you every single week, and you barely listen to that cat, but then you go out of your way to go listen to somebody else. Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? And here's another problem with that is, who is holding you accountable to the things that you're being taught, right? One, maybe this pastor isn't all on the up and up. Maybe this guy's a little bit of a nut job. Who's going to be able to fact check this guy? Well, if it's just you listening in isolation in your car, who knows, right?
Yeah.
But here's another aspect of that is, who's holding you accountable? Let's say this guy is giving you awesome things that you need to be implementing into your life. Without the church, there's nobody there to say, where are you doing this? How are you being obedient? because your pastor, your college pastor, your small group leader, whoever, has no idea what you're listening to. Like, so there could be a danger there. And then here's like kind of the last one is like, there's just this issue of like celebrity, and that we become enthralled with the people. And because we become enthralled with the people, the content becomes secondary, right? So we even mentioned a second ago, like, hey, there's 4 main folks that are there on the RT podcast, and if they're there, I listen to them. And even if you would probably even admit that there might be times that it really wasn't that good, but because those people were there, I stayed listening. Right? That can quickly become something that snowballs into a much larger issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, so how does that apply to where we are today? Like, because I mean, that was my experience in college of listening to all these pastors, and like, I'm grateful for the things that I learned from dudes like Tommy Nelson, Matt Chandler, David Platt, those cats. Yeah. And I will forever remember a lot of the things and a lot of the sermons they preached. However, there's a definitive downside. I didn't see it then, but I see it now.
Yeah, I guess I've never really heard that downside, but like what you said, this like having that soul food is good. Which I mean, I've listened to Matt Chandler, John Piper, and they're great. They're awesome. But like you said, the people who like the leaders at your church, they don't listen to that. Mm-hmm. Like they're not. I don't know. Like if Matt Chandler's like, oh, you need to. Not you need to, but try and go do this week. Like setting goals for you. There's no one to keep you in check with that. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting perspective. That's what I'm looking for. I guess I've just never really seen it that way. But
and now, granted, this is really going to be isolated to situations where like Christians are listening to people preaching, as opposed to some guy who's clearly a nut job who's telling you to go, advocate for abortion or whatever. So clearly, I mean, that doesn't pass the smell test. But for stuff like this, that is of the weightier things that we're supposed to consider, I feel like we need to think rightly about it. If we're going to think at all, we need to think rightly.
Yeah.
I think it goes on to what you said towards the end of your spiel is about you get enthralled with the people. Mm-hmm. That can almost turn into, a form of idolship that all you listen to is like, I want to see this person, hear this person, listen to this person. And that can go down where for Christians and people in the world, for Christians, like people are obsessed with like Matt Chandler, John Piper, all these mega church pastors.
Celebrity pastors,
Celebrity pastors. Right. And they're like, I'm going to listen to him just because it's him. Well, is he teaching good? Like, that's
and that
the
could
first problem.
That could come down to different celebrity pastors having different views in like slight ways, and no one physically talking you through, like helping you decipher what you believe. So, like, say one celebrity pastor says this, and then another one kind of says the same thing, a little bit different, and someone says, what do you believe about this? And you're like, oh well.
He said that.
This guy says this. This guy said this. I'm somewhere in the middle. Like, okay.
You've never had an original, never had an original thought in your life because all you're doing is just parroting back what you've heard so much of. Yeah. And that can, let's be clear, that can happen at a church that you physically go to.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. Hearing a Sunday school teacher, hearing a small group leader, hearing your pastor, hearing another pastor, whatever. That exact same thing can happen, but I feel as though we're talking about difference of degrees and kinds here. Like, I feel like there's a different kind of issue when we just default to listening to something that's become routine. Whereas I think with more effort involved, because we have to physically go to church, there's a little bit less of a risk of that happening there. But just for the sake of clarity, that can happen. I just feel like it's more likely with this media of podcasting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here's the real question then. What's the solution? As Christians, do we just bail on all things that are Christian podcasts? As Christians, do we just bail on anything that is not 100% aligned with our interests? If this other issue of like, how do we fact check? If it is something that's going to be heated or controversial, do we just avoid it? Like, what's the solution then?
I think one solution could be is just get, like you were talking about accountability, is like you could be the only one listening to this. Well, you could just get, a bunch of your friends that go to the same church and have them listen to it and maybe bring those topics up with the church elders.
Interesting. Yeah.
And just have multiple people listening to it and listening to the same podcast and coming up with their own ideas and kind of just talking through it.
Would that be the same as just being a member of those mega churches?
So this is where, we all have at least one friend that goes and serves at a church like this, but churches that have multiple campuses across different cities, it's
you're starting your own church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at some point you're worshiping at the church of, your house in your bedroom online at that point. So again, there's clearly a drawback if we were to say it was going to get to that point, but can that be used in an edifying, good way that's healthy? Because I think there is.
It's just harder.
You just have to find the balance. And to me, I don't think there's a defined balance. Like, listen, you need to go to church this amount of time this week. Not saying, but then for however long you go to church this week, you should only listen to this much media. You should only, I don't think there's defined lines. You just have to find the balance for yourself in all of the different things that are coming in, and staying on your beliefs, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's the best way I can decipher
and
the
then,
way
and
I
if
think.
somebody calls you out on it, you actually listen to them.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, this is where just accountability across the board becomes not just a matter of policing sin and these are bad things, stop doing them, but rather those are bad, these are good, let's encourage those things. Where is this beneficial? If it's not beneficial, maybe we shouldn't do it. Right? If somebody's going to call you to the carpet on that, then you listen.
I'm kind of in the same boat as Hayden over there. He just kind of summed it up.
Rock on. So, if that's true, if all these things that we've said is that 18 to 24-year-olds make up 30% of the population that listen to 5 or more podcasts a week, essentially. I know I'm kind of running all those stats together. That's not actually the case.
All of the stats in one.
Yeah, exactly. But if that's true, then having wisdom and approaching these things, and that we make either conscious decisions to ingest podcast either through video or just audio instead of other media forms. I think the one that falls by the wayside the most is what form of media falls by the wayside for most 18 to 24-year-olds right now, then?
Like, what's most popular?
Which is the one that is now the least popular? Which one do we no longer do?
I think news media.
Right, in what way? What method of ingesting it?
Like watching the 6 o'clock news.
Okay, local news for sure.
Local news, or any just news sites in general, on the internet or the, TV. Yep. It's just our generation now just doesn't care.
Well, the thing with news is if something big happens, it'll be on Twitter.
It'll be on Twitter, Instagram,
it'll be
Facebook.
somewhere. You'll see it. If it's worthwhile, you'll see it.
I saw a stat when I was looking stuff up for this that 80% of Americans get it somewhere between some to most of their news through social media.
Yeah.
Either it's direct links to a New York Times article, CNN, Washington Post.
Well, I think it's a great way to get out news
quickly,
but
not necessarily
efficiently,
truthfully.
Yeah,
that's
fake
problem.
News.
I think a lot of times just because of the era, the day that we're in, the issue is to be first, not be right. And I think that's even true for the way that we approach social media for most of us as well. Whenever we talk about the biggest and best thing, most recently, it's, I was the first one to be on board. Not, this is really good for these 10 reasons. No, we didn't put that much thought into it. So, one, we have local news, and we also have just news media in general falling by the wayside. I think the one that falls by the wayside the most is just print media. Physical books.
Yeah. Books.
Physical books.
Yeah, people using Kindles, their iPads.
Exactly.
All that kind of stuff now instead of getting an actual physical book.
Yeah. Well, when I think reading a book, I have a book. I have Jerry Seinfeld's book in my room. I've been meaning to read it. When I think reading a book, I think, you know what? I need to go to bed, but I'm not that tired. Let me start reading, and I'll get sleepy. That's my reading.
To get to sleep. Yeah. The motivation is for not even for the enjoyment of the media itself. It's for an entire
making myself tired to go to sleep. Yeah. Which I still want to read the book, but I know that's what I'm going to use it for.
But it's colored by what you're actually going to be using it for.
I think another another problem is that like with nowadays with technology is like we can't get it all on our phones or our iPads or laptops, and that people just don't want to carry around the things anymore.
Okay.
They see it as just that one more extra thing they have to put in their backpack or have in their purse or something like that, and they just don't want to. So they don't buy books. They buy them on their phones.
Mm-hmm.
That way it's more convenient, I guess.
Right. And I get that. So here's the question I want to pose to millennials, right? With a
You're
third
a
one. I'm a
millennial.
millennial,
I'm
barely.
not a millennial.
Are you not?
Nope.
He
I'm too
is.
young. No.
No, you're just a hair underneath.
I'm that.
What
Either way,
when were you born?
We're
Gen
bracketing
Z.
this thing.
Gen Z, dude.
No, you're
Did,
not.
have they even named your generation?
Yeah,
yet?
they have. Look
Okay.
it up, dude.
No,
way.
you were a millennial.
100%. I've looked it up. I'm not a
No,
millennial.
you can look it up and it'd be multiple
No.
different things.
I'm not
That's
listening
true.
to you.
So
Some say he's
I've
not
fact
a
checked.
millennial.
I was going to say
fact checked.
demographers actually differ on when generations begin and end.
Based on my demographers, I'm not a millennial.
There you go.
Ah,
With that being
jeez.
said, speaking with two
Millennials.
present college students.
There we go. That's more like
let's
it.
frame it this way: if print media,
I don't
is
feel
the
oppressed
thing,
now.
If print media is the thing that's fallen by the wayside, if podcasts are the thing that are replacing it, then I feel like there might be something there's some value in saying there's value in reading physical books, right? Just even saying in a real honest way, and not just like, oh yeah, there's value. So I want to ask you the question then. Do you have a time where you can pinpoint the point where you had the most enjoyment reading a physical book?
Oh,
Is there a time that you can look back and say, I enjoyed that in that moment, that book, that chapter, that thing?
Oh, yeah.
Whether it was a comic book or
Most
whether it was an actual
definitely.
book, whatever. So what was it for you, Chris?
I know for me, like in my early years of high school, I would do almost nothing but just read series of books,
Okay.
like nonfiction books. One of my favorite series ever is the Percy Jackson and the Olympians.
Mhm.
That like 10 book
Yeah, yeah.
series. And for me, before the movies came out and kind of ruined it,
Oh yeah.
Book snob, there we go.
those those super in-depth like adventure sci-fi nonfiction books let your imagination just run
Mm-hmm.
with it. It's like since there's no movies to base stuff off of, you're just like, well, this person looks like this, and based off how they act,
Then the movie comes on and it just throws.
and it just
everything
throws it out the window.
Gotcha.
But for me, it's like reading like the Percy Jackson series, the I Am Number 4 series. You probably don't know those.
No. Hey, I'm tracking with the first one, but not the I Am Number 4.
And just books like that you're just like, since there's nothing to base them off of, you just read it, and it's just like, well, this is interesting. Or how about like the Hunger Games?
Yeah.
Like I read the Hunger Games before it ever became popular.
Well, dude. Wow.
Yeah.
What a hippie.
What a hipster.
And like the way I was reading it and like thinking, I was like, oh, okay, this stuff looks like this, and like these things look like this, and that was just allow me to get more in depth with it and just like continue reading
Right.
because I'm like, I've put time into thinking up this imaginary
Okay.
world.
Right. So hold on to that. We'll come back to that in a second. So what about you, Haydo?
Eh,
Besides whenever you were reading Twilight.
yeah.
The Twilight series.
No. And in the seventh, I think I was in the 7th grade when I read through Percy Jackson.
Hey,
Just the original 4. All the other ones are garbage.
there are 5 originals.
No, the 5th one's garbage then. I read through all those. I liked them. It wasn't like this thing where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. Like I liked it. You know, it was okay. I read the Hunger Games. It's kind of the same thing. The one book that I could pick up and read the whole thing again and it wouldn't faze me, I'd love it, is The Martian. That's the best book I've ever read.
I've heard good
It
things
is
about that.
so good. Then the movie came out, it was just as good. And that's the one like amazing experience I've had with a book. The Bible.
Okay. Hey, you get point at me,
Hey,
man.
I'm waiting on you to Jesus
he's
juke
gonna
me
hate
here.
on us later.
Be like, oh well, so
I'm
you'd
not
rather
even
read The
gonna give you
Martian?
mine. I'm not even gonna give you mine.
But no, The Martian, like that. I read it my junior year or something. A guy I was working with at a pizza place, he gave me the book. He's like, dude, you got to read this. And I read it, and it blew my mind. But and then after that, I don't think I've read a book since. From front to back, I don't think I have.
I will admit this. Other than books that are like for ministry, and I'm not talking about like just commentaries. I'm talking about like counseling books and that kind of
Right.
jazz.
Nerd.
I have read, as far as nonfiction, the last nonfiction book I read was probably 12 years ago.
Yeah.
I just don't read those. So here is the question. Can you name the moment that you got the most enjoyment from watching a podcast?
From a podcast?
Does that, here's the point, does that instance jump out as clearly as when you were reading, and that same level of enjoyment from reading a physical book?
I think when you're reading, you kind of like picture this graph of enjoyment.
Okay.
In reading books.
I have it in my mind's eye. Show me. Show me.
Say you start at 0. You
0.
read a book, it goes up. You stop reading the book, it's back down to 0. You pick up another book, back up. Completely different like entertainment, still entertainment.
Okay.
But I think with podcasting, you kind of start with 0 and it kind of goes up and you start listening to this series of podcasts and it's kind of the same format. So you kind of stay and then maybe you listen to 2 different podcasts. Still enjoying, and you're still enjoying the other one, so that kind of builds, and you're at a higher enjoyment. So I think the highest enjoyment is when you listen to all the podcasts.
All of them, okay. I see your graph. I would disagree with
maybe not the end statement.
But no. I'm tracking with you. I'm tracking with what you're saying.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. In principle, yes.
For me, like, there's only one moment I can think of for like podcasts that I can like vividly remember. But compared to all the books I read like back in middle school and high school, it's like the podcasts have nothing on it.
Okay. All right.
Because like
podcasts are the new books.
No.
Okay, so
like
we got good opposing
thing,
views right here.
We can throw his graph thing out the window.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
I thought it was good.
I mean, it was good in the moment. I don't know if it was staying the test.
It was a
principle. The moment has passed.
It was a principle.
So, but follow that thought though. So you had even said, like, when I am reading these books before the movies come out, like, I am engaged.
Oh, yeah.
That was the word I heard, is that whenever you read, you're actively participating one way or another, right? When you are listening to a podcast, unless it's something that's like news oriented or politics, like, you're not really being challenged. It's very passive. But if you are actively engaged, does that not in some way garner a different level of enjoyment than podcasts? Because I would argue yes. And I would even argue that you have even said yes, because you immediately had an instant that sprang to mind of what you enjoyed when reading a physical Bible, but you would even have to think about a podcast like, that same level, and it would be harder to get to that point. Does that make sense?
I mean, it took me longer to think of the podcast moment compared to the books of what was that moment I enjoyed the most. And for the podcast, it took me like 5 minutes to think of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think podcasts are a continuing enjoyment. I don't think I've reached my max enjoyment level, but the more and more I listen, the more enjoyment I get out of it.
Gotcha. And I can see that. And again, this is not a time to knock podcasts because, like I said,
sure,
the irony is not lost on me that
we're doing a podcast.
We're in here sitting in a
right
small
now.
room, microphones in our face, and a camera in between all of us. Like, I get it. But at the same time, like, if all we ever do is surround ourselves with these elements of the echo chamber, and all we hear is that podcasts are great, they're great, there's no downside, just keep on doing what you're doing, then we're never going to be challenged to actually seriously consider what those things are. And here's my challenge to us, to whoever listens, to whoever watches this later, is can you think of a time that you really enjoyed physically reading a book? And then think of the time that you really enjoyed listening, partaking, watching a podcast. One, are those even at the same level? And if they're not, then why not? And if your answer is, well, I wasn't engaged, well, then, man, maybe we need to disengage from some of these podcasts and actually stick our nose in a book a little more frequently. Thoughts?
That's the most 30-year-old answer I've ever heard. But
all these young whippersnappers over here,
I like what you're saying. I like the principle.
You like the principle, but here's the question.
But
are you going to do it?
When you say peak enjoyment, I see loved it, here's the peak, and then I dropped off. And when I think podcasts, like I said, I don't think I've reached that peak. I think I'm still enjoying it. I still will. I don't think I've reached the peak yet.
Well, I'm kind of
Chris has some consternation over there.
the boat where like it's almost as like your book graph earlier. The enjoy up to this point.
Oh,
and
so
then
it
off.
does stand the test of time.
But
With an
it's
amendment?
for both books and podcasts. I feel like you can only get so much enjoyment out of one podcast or one book, but they don't, and that they can both build off of each other.
Mm-hmm. I'm tracking.
And yet, but like with books, like if it's a fiction book, some adventure book that has no movie, you have to think of how the characters look, what like how they like based off of what they're saying, how they act. With a podcast, you already have all that answered, so there's no real engagement there, unless it's a live podcast and the only engagement is, hey, what do you think of this?
Yeah, and that is a new element that's being added even in the last 4 years.
I think you're
an advent there.
I think you're confusing being engaged and like letting your mind wander. You know what I mean? Or let me rephrase that. I think you're confusing imagination. You're reading books, you're imagining all these things and interesting things. You know what I mean?
But wouldn't your imagination go off? Okay.
Keep going.
Okay. Wouldn't your imagination really be based off of the things you're interested in?
I guess.
So, like, if you're reading a book that you're super interested in, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, like, if the more you're interested in it, the more, you know, the imagination and engagement you put into it. That can be said the same with podcasts. Like, if, you know, he's interested in the MMA stuff.
Right.
So he's going to put more...
The MMA stuff.
The MMAs.
The MMAs. So he's going to put, like, he's going to think about it more, probably. I don't know. Lee Wood's head over there.
No one does.
It's cavernous. That's what it is.
It's a never-ending cavern. And so, yeah, I think interests and imagination and engagement kind of all just go together. And books do that more than podcasts.
And so, that being said, like, whether we land...
I'm staying as the silent majority.
Yeah,
right now.
okay, yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Whether we land on saying that this is something that is going to provide peak enjoyment, that is going to provide something long-lasting, or whether it's going to be peak enjoyment that is, like, here, now, and then immediately falls off. At the end of the day, I still think both of you are saying, like, there is a different level of engagement that happens whenever you physically have something in front of you. My whole point to ending this section is just saying... Why don't we do more? I think part of the answer is we're lazy, right? Our default has simply become something else, that we are so ingrained in this pattern of doing otherwise that's the reason why we don't do it anymore. Not because it's not of value, but because we have lost that sense of value because we just don't do it anymore.
Because you've already peaked.
Okay, because you've already peaked. But that's the thing. But you would even say that peak could be attained once again. Like you could re-summit that same level over and over again, right? That's something that's different, yes, but it requires effort. And I think at the end of the day, 18 to 24-year-olds and even 33-year-olds, that's just not their thing. And if that's not their thing, but we would all sit here and say there is something intrinsically different and also valuable about that, then maybe we should pursue it a little bit more. Yeah? Thoughts?
Yeah.
Yes. Hayden's over there. Maybe.
He's
maybe.
a silent majority.
Man,
He doesn't
silent
get to
majority.
speak.
I'm gonna end by saying peaking in podcasting is easier than peaking in books. Wait.
No, wait.
Peaking in
Books.
books. No.
No, because you said you
Peaking
had
in
to watch
books.
all podcasts.
Peaking in books
is easier.
takes more effort than peaking in podcasting.
Okay. On the people who produce it or the people who consume it?
People who consume. Only because you have to put out an effort to read a book.
Yes.
No, I get you there. No, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
So
I worded that terribly. I'm so sorry.
No. Whether we agree or disagree in that regard, I still feel like that's something that's worthwhile. So, cool. I think that we have exhausted our time here. We have exhausted our battery. That's actually what
Battery is exhausted.
Yeah,
Oh, is that what happened?
so we now know the camera has a lifespan of about 40 minutes, so we don't need to run past that. But
wow.
that being said, I'm glad you guys were here. So, Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Hayden, thank you for being here.
Thanks for lunch.
All right. Yeah, hey, you're
Thanks
welcome for lunch. So we're just going to sign off here. This has been the link, and we're just going to say, like we're going to try to end every time. I don't know. This might be the thing we end with. Would I end with our benediction at Connect?
Peace out. Do drugs.
Nope, not it. It is do good and don't sin.
Ayo.